have to be restricted for the sake of the wider public interest. Privacy itself is a vital public interest, and individuals shouldn't have to yield to the public interest in an unlimited fashion. And finally, lawmakers should heavily restrict how they use any information that has been collected during a crisis. Sorry about that. Also, this information should not be diverted to any other purpose.
I'm going to interrupt you for just 1 second. There was an error on my side of getting the stream up and going, so you are now live. You weren't until now.
Okay.
My apologies. So for those of you who are now jumping in, I'm going to do the terrible presenter thing and ask our lovely speaker over here to restart. I do apologize.
That is not a problem. I can certainly do that. Let me back up here. Okay, so we're going to do an abbreviated version of this talk now. So welcome to Privacy in a Time of Pandemic. I'm going to briefly mention that I work for McKinsey in healthcare privacy and security. The important factor here is that you can get the slides on GitHub. So if you want sort of the fuller version or to see the sources for any of the content here, you're welcome to do that. Please also feel free to connect with me on Twitter or LinkedIn if you have any questions or you just want to say hi. I also want to point out before we begin this talk again that privacy is very much an evolving topic during the pandemic. There's never been a pandemic during the modern era where we have questions about digital privacy and online rights. So everything is new and constantly evolving, and even some of the things I say today may possibly be outdated by the time that you're hearing it over YouTube. So we're going to focus the conversation around competing values. We've got the public good, which is anything that is for the benefit or the well-being of the public. And then we have private rights. So this would be considered civil liberties or the idea of being subject only to laws established for the good of the community. So there's a global spectrum, and the US tends to be the furthest toward private rights, while a country like China is further toward public health. There's a big range in between. These differences are driven largely by culture, but also possibly by legal rules as well, and just the general structure of the government. So as we think about this spectrum, and we look at the more restrictive or less restrictive countries, there's a lot of information that's available here. It's a little bit too much to get into today, but it is a helpful way to think about how countries choose to approach the pandemic and some of the decisions that they make. So there's really no perfect balance here. Even fully pursuing the public good or private rights would require some sacrifice from that other value. So we also have to acknowledge the validity of privacy infringement during a crisis. It's very difficult to fight something like this without doing some kind of infringement on private rights. However, we want to keep in mind that privacy itself is a public good that should be upheld. So the question is, at what point can we no longer compel individual behavior for the good of the community? One of the possible answers, and I think the answer that I take to this, is that we should end that infringement when there's no longer any compelling evidence that the effect we're pursuing has a clear benefit or a good for the community. So Hu Yong, a professor at Peking University School of Journalism and Communication, recommended 3 principles for lawmakers. He first said that they should treat intrusions on privacy in the public interest as exceptions rather than norms, and that those exceptions must be justified by human rights law. He also said that lawmakers should define the basic civil rights guarantees that should hold even if privacy is weakened. Privacy itself may sometimes have to be restricted, but that doesn't mean that individuals should have to yield to the public interest in an unlimited way. He also says that lawmakers should heavily restrict how they use any information collected during the crisis.
No.
Hungary had actually suspended some GDPR rights, including rights to access and erasure of personal information. And those who lodge a complaint or exercise their right would have had to wait until the government declared an end to the crisis in order to have those rights back. So this was heavily criticized, as many privacy proponents said that there shouldn't be any exceptions to GDPR just because of the pandemic. So the US has also made some changes to health privacy law. These have been a bit more measured and more reasonable. Have you lost me?
We did for a moment, and it looks like we're back up. I'm verifying now. We do appear to be live.
Looks like we're back. Okay, so some of the privacy law crisis exceptions were created under Project BioShield. So this project allowed waivers for the requirements to obtain a patient's agreement to speak with family members or friends involved in patient's care, requirements to honor a request to opt out of the directory, the requirement to distribute a notice of privacy practices, the right to request privacy restrictions, and the right to request confidential communications. This was set up after 9/11. Project BioShield was an amendment to the Social Security Act that allowed for crisis exceptions to HIPAA. So if you've ever wondered how federal or state level COVID data is being gathered, it's usually under a pre-existing legal provision. So the US does allow some disclosure of a patient's infection or exposure status without their authorization. This tends to be under a few limited causes for that justify the sharing, but we'll kind of skip over that, and I'll tend to abbreviate some of these so we can get through them faster. Also, some HIPAA rules are lifted for community-based testing sites. These are sites that offer mobile drive-through or walk-up sites. While it is encouraged that they continue to follow the security rules for HIPAA, these sites will not be penalized if they fail to do so. Some business associates or health subcontractors can also disclose health data to authorities without authorization. This is in the event that the federal public health authorities or oversight agencies would request information directly from the business associates. HSS also stated that all civil liberties, that especially those regarding age, disability, and minority status, should still be honored and will not impact treatment, which is a really positive thing to see that they have reaffirmed these anti-discrimination requirements. So what does it mean when we think about breaking the rules here? What are all of these exceptions about? So the idea is that the rules still exist. They aren't suspended, but punishments and penalties won't be applied to organizations who break rules under these certain exceptions. So this means that they're still expected to comply with all of the HIPAA rules. However, when they do unintentionally make some kind of mistake, then they won't be penalized the way that they normally would have been. So most of these organizations will tend to still follow the same rules because they have been doing so for years, and it's kind of expected that they will just continue normal operations. So the question is my data, my health data, at higher risk? Possibly, but we don't necessarily want to jeopardize some of the healthcare and testing availability just for the sake of privacy and security. So that's the fine line that we have to approach to figure out where we're comfortable making exceptions in order to facilitate crisis management.
I don't know what's going on.
So there are also many changes to telehealth. I'm just going to pull up all of these at once. So you see lifted penalties for reducing and waiving Medicare and Medicaid patient copays for telehealth. You also see good faith provisioning of telehealth, and the lifting of penalties for violations of privacy, security, and breach notification rules that occurred during the good faith provisioning of telehealth. These exceptions apply to COVID-19 cases and other services. and physicians are banned from using public-facing communications,
Live. Okay.
but allowed to use non-public
Right.
facing
Chester,
apps
do
and
you want
texting platforms.
to
So if you ever wanted to
go
get your
into
doctor to
one
use
go?
Signal, this would be the time for that.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for tuning into my
So
talk.
we see a
My
lot
name
of
is Dr.
emerging
Chris, and I
laws
work with
as
my
well.
colleagues
There are several
across the
COVID
state of
privacy
Washington
laws that have
to
been proposed with
hopefully
very
share
different
our results.
structures and outcomes.
All right, let's get
So
started.
the primary three laws
So,
right now are the
just for those of you who are
CCDPA.
new to
This
this
one
website,
preempts state
we're
laws and would
basically
cut
going
back on
to
existing state
convert a
privacy
few
rights.
files
So, for example, the
and take
CCPA
them to
would be
state routine
preempted,
pen testing.
and in Illinois,
So today we're going to
people
talk
would
about
no longer
steps
be
and
free
tricks
from
and some of the things that are
unconsented
necessary
biometric
in
surveillance
order
for
to get
COVID
better at
purposes.
red teaming and to get
So
information
this
so this is a
preemption
kind
would
of an
also be
overview of what
permanent,
it
would
is.
not be lifted after the crisis is over, and has no private right of action. And it does allow for quite a lot of employer surveillance. So this is not really the ideal law that we would like to see passed. The ENPA, however, applies only to companies that operate automated exposure notification services. It has special requirements for these services, that they collaborate with public health officials, obtain consent, provide a security and privacy policy, and several other requirements relating to security of this testing data. It is much smaller in scope, and it does not establish any private right of action. So it is weaker than the PHEPA, but it does have relatively sound principles. This one is also more likely to pass than any of the others because it has stronger bipartisan support and is much smaller in scope. The PHEPA is the strongest one. This does require things like opt-in consent, data minimization, and limitation of data disclosure to the government. And it has a strong private right of action. However, it's very unlikely that this one will pass because it is not very popular among one of one of the parties. So we talk a lot about contact tracing, and that's what we're going to talk about a lot today, but there are a lot of other ways for data to be used and potentially misused during the pandemic. So if you want to think about some of the other options, go back to the slides and look at some of these types of applications, what they're being used for and where it's in place currently. So we're going to talk about contact tracing. So this is the process of tracking down an individual who has an infectious disease and the people that that person has potentially been in contact with. This began as early as the 1500s in an effort to track the spread of syphilis from the Americas to Europe. So traditional contact tracing is heavily focused on manual human effort. It's interview based, requires expert judgment, and tends to be only invasive for those who are actually infected and exposed. So on the other hand, we now have digital contact tracing, which requires devices or sensors or some other way of identifying where people are, and focuses on general, broad dragnet type data sets that includes everyone, not just the infected. Also, it requires participation across 60 to 75% of the populace to be effective, which is quite challenging. So both of these methods are essentially hopeless without effective testing programs, human labor, and large data sets. And both of them can have a chilling effect if they're done poorly. And likewise, both of them are almost pointless once community spread is high enough that there's no longer any hope of being able to actually get a benefit from understanding what the contact is. So with the tracing apps, there's been a mix of government or private industry actors, sometimes with minimal or no oversight. There's also been lackluster adoption among users because the privacy technology in place is very complex and difficult for people to understand, and many people are rightfully a little skeptical of it. In places like China, there are some mandatory requirements to use tracing apps. So there's a question there about whether they'll be voluntary or mandatory, and whether or not these are going to be pushed by a government or they're just opt-in by users who are concerned. Virginia was the first state to use the Google plus Apple technology, and the UK switched to it recently. This is a new type of sort of hybrid collaborative contact tracing methodology. It's Bluetooth based, and it allows contact tracing apps that work across both iOS and Android phones via APIs. Now, there is a low trust across users, both in the government and the technology industry. So even if the privacy protections that are in place are good and strong, most users are confused by them. Apple and Google have also said that they plan to disable their program when it's no longer needed, but they haven't said what those criteria will be when it counts as no longer necessary. So there's no real confidence that they actually will disable the program. So we also have the question of consent and control. Consent requires informed affirmative opt-in with a privacy notice provided before any data is collected, and the ability to have data deleted when withdrawing consent. So consent is also invalid when it's coerced. This brings up questions of whether or not you can force someone to use a contact tracing app for things like employment, voting, public accommodation, education, or government benefits. So there's not currently any clear protection against employer mandates to use contact tracing apps at work. The EEOC has also stated that COVID-19 constitutes a direct threat, so OSHA would apply here potentially, and there may be some ability to force people to use contact tracing apps in an effort to comply with OSHA. So beyond the legal requirements and consent, there are other challenges with contact tracing apps relating to privacy. In an analysis of 47 contact tracing apps, there were several privacy issues that were found relating to tracking and advertising. We also need to think about geolocation and proximity data, especially the effectiveness of this data. One of the challenges here is interpretation, what this data means if you can even get it. So GPS data is only reliable up to about 16 feet in ideal conditions, and potentially as much as 10,000 meters when it's not ideal. So this makes it virtually unusable for contact tracing and only valid for population density metrics, such as how many people are located in one area. Bluetooth proximity data can't distinguish between things like users sat on opposite sides of a wall or in parked cars next to each other. So without any kind of empirical showing of accuracy and actionability, the use of tracing apps that focused on Bluetooth technology is possibly no more effective than security theater, or you might call it public health theater. We also need to think about data anonymization. So anonymization is aggregation plus entropy in order to de-identify individuals from data points. So the Google plus Apple privacy mechanisms could be overcome by developers or those who have larger data sets who'd be able to relink that information with positive IDs. Now, current privacy laws such as HIPAA regulate based on linkable PII, personally identifiable information such as social security numbers or sensitive information like medical codes. But there's no laws in place now about how you would regulate the, looks like I've lost my screen share, one moment.
We do still seem to see it on
Okay.
YouTube. Google with the cameras is showing right now.
Okay, excellent. I'll just keep going then. So the problem with HIPAA and the reason that it's flawed is that because it is old, it doesn't take into account advances in how privacy can be interrupted by the re-identifiability of data. So a regulatory gap exists for large entropy reducers, such as internet search providers and commercial data brokers who would have sufficient information to re-identify data sets. So the question here is, has history ever shown that once the government has surveillance tools, it will maintain modesty and caution when using them? History seems to suggest that the answer to this is no. We see this during what was called the Total Information Awareness Program, which was a massive US data mining project focused on scanning travel, financial, and other data from public and private sources. This was a DARPA program that arose after 9/11. So even though it was terminated and the program ceased funding, it was found that much of the technology was simply moved to another agency, specifically the NSA. So the TIA was scaled down in large part due to public outcry, primarily because of this extremely creepy logo the Latin that you see on this logo here. It means knowledge is power. And you can see that logo on this DARPA slide. This data flow slide was one of the original presentations of what this program would be able to do. So this was data mining of, the early 2000s. This same hype is available today in machine learning and artificial intelligence. You see these popping up in response to COVID. So the rhetoric and justification is similar. How will we scale back from these technologies when the crisis is over? I love this quote from Tony Blair. A new and deadly virus has emerged. The virus is terrorism whose intent to inflict destruction is unconstrained by human feeling. So since 9/11, information acquired on national security grounds has been used to prosecute commonplace domestic crimes such as mortgage fraud. So in July, HHS stripped the CDC of its infection tracking responsibility to create a new program called HHS Protect, which would allow the collection of personal information about physical and psychological health history, drug and alcohol use, diet, employment, geospatial records, and more. Not just about people who test positive, but about their family members, as well as people who potentially have not tested at all. So this data could be collected from many, many different sources and would potentially be permanently stored, unlike the current 4-year retention limit. So the question is, what happens next? And I really wish that I knew and had some kind of reassuring statement to provide here. There are quite a few developing topics. If you're interested in this concept, go to the GitHub slides and read up on some of the other issues that you could spend hours and hours speaking about and researching, and watch for things that are happening in these areas. So if you're looking for some actions and you want to know what you can do, you can start by voting. That's happening soon. Make sure you've done it. Please vote for all of the people who don't have the right to. Also express your views on pending legislation to your representatives. Please also donate to privacy protecting organizations like the EFF and the ACLU, who are doing really good work to help in this area. You can also attempt to understand your legal privacy rights for health and online data, especially as they continue to evolve. And research apps carefully before you install them and share any of your data. And don't panic. Some data sharing is going to be necessary to fight the pandemic, so we don't want to completely shut down the ability to actually do the kind of necessary work to help scale back from the crisis. And finally, weigh the value of your private rights against the public good. There's never going to be a perfect place on the spectrum that's the right answer, so you need to think about where you feel comfortable fitting and where you would like to see America fit. Okay, so that's a very fast version of this talk. My Twitter and LinkedIn information is available there. Please contact me if you would like to speak further about it or you have any other questions or follow-ups. And it's Q&A time. If we have any time, I don't think we have more than a couple of minutes, but I will hand it back.
Very, very late on that one, and I do apologize. That was entirely on my side. So I'm looking right now at, I don't see anybody who is commenting in the Track 1 chat channel at this moment, other than some questions about whether you're experiencing some anxiety about your low battery. But
I am. I don't. It's not charging right now.
I want to thank you so much for coming and being a part of this, and thank you for. I apologize for the guinea pig troubles that you're having in our first talk here.
That's okay. I'm happy to participate. Sorry for my part of the technical challenges as well. But I'm really happy that I was able to be here and speak about this. I love this topic and very much appreciate you having me here for it.
All right, well, thank you very much. If anybody has more questions for Amber, she will be available on we can get her to answer some questions in the Track 1 chat if she would like. You can probably DM her, and it looks like she has provided her GitHub. So if there's anything else, reach out to her there, or we can probably get you in touch with her if we need to. So thank you all for coming to join, and this would be track 1 out for this session.